69,300 homes. Started. On paper. The sites were empty. 7 months from now, the deadline arrives. And most people in this country have no idea it is coming. Here's the map. In 2024, the Irish government announced a record number of housing commencement notices, 69,300. Ministers described it as evidence the housing crisis was turning. The Taoiseach called housing the defining issue. The Taoiseach called it a national emergency that was finally being addressed. The numbers were real. The question, the one buried in the internal documents, was whether the houses were. That distance between what is registered and what is built, between the map and the territory, is the story of Irish housing policy. It always has been. And in April 2026, RTA News published the government papers that finally made that distance visible. 3 things will be answered here. First, how did the state design a scheme where 69,300 homes could be registered without a single foundation being poured? Second, what did the Department of Finance and the Department of Housing, Local Government, and Heritage write to each other when the inspection results came back? And third, what happens on the 31st of December 2026 when the clock stops? In Fingal County, north of Dublin, there are currently more than 5,000 households on the social housing waiting list. The average wait is over 4 years. These are people who applied, who qualified, who are still waiting. In 2024, Fingal was one of the counties where developers registered the highest volumes of commencement notices under the government's Levy Waiver Scheme. And then, when the scheme ended, commencements in Fingal collapsed by 84%. Not softened, not adjusted, 84%. The families on the waiting list are still there. The sites are not. 7,062. That is the number of eviction notices issued in Ireland in the first 3 months of 2026. The highest quarterly figure since the Residential Tenancies Board began recording them. A 51% increase on the same period a year earlier. 2,519 of those notices were in Dublin. 739 in Cork. 446 in Galway. 60% were issued because the landlord intended to sell. These were not abstract regulatory events. These were families in February and March of this year being told their home was no longer their home. In the same quarter, the government's housing numbers were supposed to be showing record progress. Before we go further, drop the county or city you're watching from into the comments below. Tell me how much time you have right now. Are you on a short break, or are you in for the full picture? The geography of this audience genuinely surprises me every time. Back to the documents now, because this is where the story stops being about numbers and starts being about what the system knew. The Department of Finance and the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage were corresponding about this problem in writing, not in public, internally. The Department of Finance paper said, the record volume of commencement notices raises questions about whether the sector could translate those notices into completed units as efficiently as it had historically. The Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, in its own note, said that officials needed to be careful with language so as not to misrepresent matters by conflating 2 separate issues. The 2 issues it was careful not to conflate were, 1, the number of homes being built, and 2, the story those numbers were telling. The inspections that came back showed a rate of non-starts on registered sites 3 times higher than the historical norm. 3 times. The Department of Finance concluded that at least some of the commencement notices associated with the operation of the Levy Waiver Scheme had not materialized, which is, technically, a finding about paperwork, which is, technically, the problem. The public version of this story is accurate. The government announced record commencement notices in 2024. That is true. It is also incomplete. Here is the part that was left out. Everything you have just heard, the waiting lists, the evictions, the falling commencement figures, that is the consequence. The mechanism that produced it is something more specific, and the mechanism is where the money is. Here is how the Development Levy Waiver Scheme actually worked. From April 2023, developers who registered a commencement notice before December 2024 were entitled to have their local authority development charges waived. Ishka Aaron would refund water connection fees. The state would pay. The condition for receiving this benefit was registration of the notice, not completion of the foundation, not evidence of construction activity on the site. Registration. South Dublin County Council confirmed the terms in writing. The scheme requires completion of the development no later than the 31st of December 2026. But the payment, the waiver, the refund, went out when the paperwork was filed. In 2024, 3 successive months produced record commencement notice volumes. The Department of Finance noted that this surge was largely attributable to developers rushing to take advantage of the scheme before it closed. And then the scheme closed. And in 2025, total commencements fell from 69,300 to 16,000, a fall of precisely 77% in a single year. In Fingal and South Dublin, the fall was 84%. The Banking and Payments Federation Ireland issued a warning. Without a significant rebound in commencements during 2026, housing output in 2027 would likely fall. The Economic and Social Research Institute revised its forecast for 2026 completions down to around 36,000 units. The government's own target, set as part of its housing plan, requires 50,000 homes per year to make meaningful progress against the crisis. If this channel's analysis is what has been missing from your feed, subscribe. No spin, no hysteria, just the full picture. Now, back to where this actually lands. The problem is this: 69,300 commencement notices, a significant proportion of which may not correspond to homes under construction. The intensification, and it is actually worse than that, is that Ireland needs to build approximately 50,000 homes per year to close the housing gap. The pipeline that was supposed to be generating that supply was, in material part, a pipeline of registered documents rather than registered foundations. And the resolution, or the question that will stand in for a resolution, arrives on the 31st of December 2026. That deadline is the condition built into the scheme. Local authorities are entitled to require a certificate of compliance on completion. If the certificate cannot be produced, the outstanding levy becomes a charge on the land. Developers who registered commencement notices and did not build are, in principle, required to pay back the benefit they received. Fingal County Council has confirmed that applications under the Temporary Development Contribution Waiver Scheme are now closed. South Dublin County Council has confirmed the completion deadline. What neither council nor the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage has publicly confirmed is the existence of a systematic inspection program to verify which of those 69,300 registered sites will meet the deadline. The same internal documents that flagged the non-start problem in 2024 did not describe a verification mechanism for 2026. 7 months away. No public plan published. But all of that is still institutional. Here is what it actually means for the household that pays the bill. The average market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Ireland in early 2026 is €2,100 per month. That is the largest quarterly increase since the daft.ie rental report series began in 2002, 4.4% in a single quarter. According to the Parliamentary Budget Office, more than 115,000 households have an ongoing social housing need in Ireland, a figure that includes the 58,824 on formal local authority waiting lists and tens of thousands more on the Housing Assistance Payment Scheme. These are the families for whom the pipeline of registered commencement notices was supposed to represent progress. They are the people who will still be on waiting lists in Fingal and Cork and Galway on the 1st of January 2027, after the deadline is passed and the question of what was built and what was not has finally been answered. For those watching from the UK or the US, this is the Ireland that exists behind the housing statistics, not the Ireland of the press release with the record numbers. The Ireland where the gap between the map and the territory has a completion date, and nobody has yet explained how it will be measured. The map said 69,300. The territory will answer in December. Watch the Central Statistics Office data on commencements for April and May of 2026 when it publishes in the coming weeks. That data will show whether the pipeline is refilling or whether the collapse of 2025 is continuing into this year. Watch the parliamentary questions to the Minister for Housing on the recovery mechanism for levy waivers on sites that do not complete. The answers to those questions will say more about how Irish housing policy actually functions than any target, any plan, or any record commencement figure ever announced from Leinster House. The gap between the map and the territory, it closes on the 31st of December, or it does not.